Hello and welcome to the fourth season of the Omnibus Podcast, Episode 2, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a political activist and former state representative from southern Minnesota. And as usual, we're joined by Walter Hudson, who Wikipedia tells me is the sixth most obese human in medical history. And holder of the Guinness World Records for the largest waist. Of course, I found out quickly that's a different Walter Hudson. He's actually one of 4 politicians on Wikipedia named Walter Hudson, and he's not the proprietor of a plus-sized magazine. So, Walter Hudson is in fact a state representative from District 30A, based in Albertville. Walter, do you get that a lot? You say, "Hey, are you the guy with the biggest waist?"
No. So when I was a kid, because this guy's been famous forever, for a very long time. And when I was a kid, you would get, some kid would make that connection and I'd catch some muck for it. But in adulthood, I have rarely ever heard reference to that guy. And I'm pretty sure he died quite some time ago for obvious reasons. But yeah.
Well, I don't have a lot of famous Jeremy Munsons out there, but
Sure.
but I did receive an email one time with first class airline tickets to Paris to go and give private tennis lessons to somebody's daughter. And there's a Jeremy Munson that's a tennis pro in LA. And but I got his emails. I do get his emails once in a while. And somebody actually sent me a link for a first class airline ticket to Paris and accommodations and everything else. And the temptation to fly to LA to get on that plane, because I had the passport, right? Got the name and everything. It was pretty tempting to go and jump on his flight. But I don't have any obese people out there on Wikipedia with the same name. On today's show, Walter and I are going to dig into a few different bills, but in the news, you'll hear a lot about the SRO bill, the School Resource Officer bill. This is legislation that passed last year that was restricting what school resource officers can do. Specifically, and we'll let Walter dig into this, but the prone restraint, kneeling on someone's neck or restricting their airway with the chokehold, and Democrats passed this bill putting the restriction on school resource officers, and in response, police departments pulled their officers from the schools. And there was a lot of disagreement on what this law did and doesn't do. And so, Walter, I want to hear from you, in your opinion, what passed last year, what did it do, and what's the fix, and where is it at now?
Well, I'll just say at the outset that this has been... At root, this is one of the simplest issues imaginable, and they have managed to turn it into the most complicated gobbledygook of a mess that I think, if that was their goal, I'd be impressed at how well they've executed taking something very simple and turning it into something extremely complex, ambiguous, and difficult to follow and understand. And I'm saying this as somebody who has a front row seat. Like, I sit on the Public Safety Committee. I see and hear the bills and the amendments, and I'm privy to the process to an extent of how this has all gone down. And I can't even tell you what everything actually means and how it's actually going to pan out and what the actual end effect is going to be on school resource officers in the communities that they serve.
Well,
so
let me just back up at the beginning so that people who aren't as familiar with this can understand. There's a difference between a police officer and someone who is assigned to be in a school. There's different training that person has to take. I don't even know if they're armed in a school or not, but it's a different role for a police officer. It isn't just somebody that shows up and hangs out at the school. They actually go through different training. Is that right?
I think that's part of what this process is attempting to address. My understanding has been that a school resource officer is simply a police officer who's been contracted via the municipality that they work for to be in the school and serve as a resource, hence the name, for the students, staff, and faculty. And is that going to look different in terms of on-the-ground interaction than it would out on the street? Yeah, largely it's going to look a lot more like a small town cop. It's going to look a lot more like a Andy Griffith type situation in Mayberry, because the school is the small town and everybody knows everybody, and there's this kind of inherent casual relationship that the students and staff and faculty have with this officer who they know by name, and they often wear a different style of uniform that's more casual in appearance. That to the extent that they are armed, they probably conceal it more than they otherwise would if they were out on the street. And so it's a different role, but I would not, and that's where we need to be careful, right? Is they're still a police officer. Like at root, that's still what they are. And the rules and regulations and policies and standards that apply to any given police officer probably ought to apply to school resource officers as well. What we can't have and shouldn't have is two totally different standards for use of force in this case, or frankly, for anything, um, that we have to apply to a school resource officer that wouldn't apply to a patrol officer who's working out on the street. And so, prior to this language that was smuggled into the education omnibus bill last year and was heard in public safety, the standard for use of force that applied to school resource officers was the same standard that applies to police officers wherever they are. And that's the reasonable use of force standard, which, as it suggests, means that if an officer engages in a restraint that there's some question about, the standard that's going to prevail in determining whether or not that officer acted rightly or wrongly is, would a reasonable officer in the same circumstances have done the same thing? Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that standard. It is quite literally a reasonable standard. And so to impose specifically on school resource officers some different standard, it's by definition an unreasonable standard. And that's exactly what they did. Now, you point out, as they are happy to do, that this spelled out that you can't use prone restraint, you can't use chokeholds and restraints that restrict airflow and what have you. But the fact of the matter is that the prohibition on what school resource officers could do was much broader and less ambiguous than that, or more ambiguous than that, where you had different people reading this statute in very different ways. And the most cautious, from a litigation standpoint, the most cautious municipalities were reading it and saying, what this means is that my school resource officer cannot intervene in a student overturning a room in the school. Like if a student flips out and starts turning over desks and throwing stuff at the wall and putting holes in the wall and breaking stuff, anything that doesn't rise to the level of presenting, because this is what the wording of the language was, anything that doesn't rise to the level of presenting an imminent threat of bodily harm or death, the officer can't do anything about it.
Right. So, like in your example, well, first of all, to back up too, to put kind of some numbers on this, my understanding is that schools reported, this is in the 2021 to 22 school year, 10,000 incidents of staff or school resources officers having to restrain a student. So that's physical contact with a student, having to, hold them, restrain them in some way. How many of those were to protect the student from hurting themselves, or just to have them calm down? Like you said, they're throwing
Right.
a fit and flipping over tables, or actually breaking up a fight where they're preventing harm for another student. The language that passed last year, specified that if you're going to be restraining a student, you can only do so if they're potentially going to harm another student or themselves.
Right.
And in specifically called out that they can't use a prone restraint that would restrict someone's airway. On its surface, it sounds reasonable, but police departments then said, well, if you're going to have a different standard of rules for our police officers than somebody on the street that's trying to restrain somebody who's committing a crime, then we're going to pull our resource officers out of the schools. And a lot of police departments did that.
So let me back up just a smidge there to the notion that on its face, it's reasonable to restrict prone restraint and restraint techniques that potentially obstruct airflow. If that were true, if it were true that it is in fact reasonable to prohibit those restraints, then nothing needed to change because, again, we have a reasonable use of force standard in the law.
Right.
Okay.
But your
So,
your son has autism.
yep.
There's a lot of parents whose children act out or may do something in school where they don't want their teacher sitting on them or holding them down because they're having a medical issue or a seizure or whatever. So they want to clarify that the only reason that you're going to restrain somebody is if they're actually going to hurt somebody else or themselves.
Right. So that's a great example, and I'm glad you brought it up because it gives me the opportunity to refine my point, which is that under this language that they introduced, you're right, a school resource officer wouldn't be able to do that, but you know who could? Johnny Q officer off the street who got called in on a 911 call and doesn't know anything about that student, has no idea that they're autistic, isn't familiar with their IEP, doesn't know what their special needs are. That guy can run in and tackle the kid and sit on him, right? So what you've actually done is you've taken a situation where reasonable use of force could be more directly applied by somebody who has a broader sense of the circumstances, a school resource officer who knows that kid and probably knows his IEP and his special needs, versus having a scenario where that officer is restricted in terms of the options available to them. And now you're potentially bringing somebody in from off the street who doesn't know the circumstances of the situation as well. And for some reason is enabled under the law to engage in activity. Because that's the thing is, whether or not a certain restraint is considered reasonable is going to take into consideration those specific circumstances, right? So an officer who's called in off the street to respond to an incident, who doesn't know all of that background, when his actions are evaluated, it might be deemed reasonable because he doesn't know what he doesn't know and can't be expected to know what he doesn't know. Whereas the school resource officer, who has a greater degree of specific knowledge regarding the specific persons and circumstances, could do the exact same thing and be held to account for it being unreasonable because he should have taken into account the things that he was privy to in making his decision in terms of how to respond. So the point is that the reasonable use of force standard is a flexible standard that takes into account the specific circumstances of a specific situation. And rather than let that lie, which would have been perfectly fine, there was no problem to solve here. You've got a bunch of radical anti-cop activists led by Cedric Frazier in the House who we know what their motivation is because they can't shut up about it. Every chance they get, they're name dropping George Floyd. This is somehow about George Floyd. School resource officers. That somehow has something to do with how your kids' behavior is regulated in your school. I don't know how. They haven't explained it, but here we are. And so that radical BLM CRT agenda is what is driving all of this. And they say, no, we're going to impose restrictions that with their Venn diagram between what an officer can do and what is considered reasonable use of force, the circles don't even touch anymore. There's now this gap where something could be considered reasonable, but it's not going to be something that's allowed. It's just an untenable situation for officers to be in. And so, this bill came forward, this so-called fix that Cedric Frazier put forward, and at face value, it had a lot of problems with it, and I think it still does, because what it does is it takes out and adds a bunch of language that the net result of it supposedly is that officers can do whatever it is that they feel they ought to do under the reasonable use of force standard. Now, I don't trust that, because if that was actually what you were trying to accomplish, you would just cross out your stupid language and go back to the way things work, because that's the way it was. But supposedly that's the effect of all this new language that they've put into place, some of which seems contradictory. I mean, you've on one hand, you've got like a list of duties that a school resource officer shall engage in. But then at the very end, this is one of the latest amendments that they accepted from Republican Representative Jeff Whitty, who's a former school resource officer. They accepted at the very tail end of this list of duties a stipulation that nothing in this subsection in any way interferes with an officer's ability to do their job under 609.6 or whatever the criminal statute is. And it's like, okay, well then what's the point then? Like, why if the last rule in your list of rules is none of these rules actually matter, then what the hell do you need the rules for? Right? Like and then on top of that, they're gonna have they still have this model policy that's going to be developed by the post board, which is the licensing board that determines whether or not a cop can even be a cop. And that policy shall be adopted by all of the law enforcement agencies and under threat of license sanction or injunctive action. In other words, you can lose your ability to be a police officer if you don't go along with whatever the post board says. Well, what the hell do you need that for? And that's still in there, even now. Even with it supposedly, we've supposedly had this kumbaya moment where it's going to come to the floor and we're all going to vote for it. That provision is still there. And I asked Cedric Frazier today in committee, I was a little snarky in that I asked him, I kind of evoked my inner Office Space, and I was like, what exactly is it that your bill does here? Like, what is this? Like, what was the point of all this? Like, I'm reading this thing and you're telling me that it doesn't have it, that we don't have anything to be concerned about, and that it doesn't do any of the things that we've been ringing alarm bells saying it does. And yet yet it's still an 8-page bill with a bunch of language. So what does that language accomplish? What does it achieve? What is it doing? And his answer was this kind of very artfully crafted gobbledygook about bringing in stakeholders to have a seat at the table. And it raises the question of, okay, to what end? Seat at the table to do what? And what I suspect is that at the end of the day, we're going to see SROs come back into school. There's going to be this big kumbaya moment. Everybody's going to pat themselves in the back of we came together, we solved this problem. And in the short term, it will appear as though we have. And then a year from now, 6 months from now, 18 months from now, the post board is going to come out with their model policy, and it's going to be adopted, and it's going to impose all sorts of restrictions upon what SROs can do. And suddenly we're going to find ourselves right back in the same old problem. The only difference will be there'll be nothing that the legislature can do about it because we already gave up our authority to the post board.
Yeah. And that's a sad part about this is when there's an argument and the legislature abdicates its responsibility for setting rules to unelected bureaucrats and or appointed by the governor, or where the balance is appointed by the governor, and and you can't change it after that. The bottom line, first of all, there was a lot of resource officers that were pulled from schools, including ours. And then they, with discussions of the attorney general and the police unions, they settled on their understanding of what this new law was. And so a lot of the school resource officers already returned. Some schools may still be without, but today the police unions have come to an agreement with Cedric Frazier, right? And what the Segregations are happy with it. The Democrats are happy with it. It's frustrating because we know where it could go, right? They've opened the door to do things in the future, and the legislature has less responsibility to change things in the future because it's going to be handled by outside groups.
You got it.
Okay. So nothing necessarily resolved, but at least the Democrats have taken away Republicans' ability to campaign against them on the SRO issue because they're gonna say that it's resolved.
Well, I mean, you might think that, but that's not something that I'm going to say because honestly, and look, this at the end of the day, this isn't about a campaign. We got plenty of stuff we can campaign against the Democrats about. We didn't need this SRO issue to be one of them.
Well,
but it still remains.
But school fights, I mean, this is something that's so personal to people. When a fight breaks out in their school and they feel like, where was the officer to actually solve this? Why are their kids, sending other kids to the hospital? They want school resource officers. Was a very, very personal thing that is one of those moments where it engages a lot of people. It's like the let them play movement where the governor had forced masks on kids in sports. That brought people into this fight that were not political, and so having the
One of
Democrats,
them is my colleague now,
yeah, yeah, right,
Gilman. Yeah.
right. And so this was an important issue. It still is, that needs to be thoroughly discussed, and the parents need to know what's going on, and hopefully what comes out of this is something that actually solves the problem, because it's brought a lot more people into the fight. Let's jump into Senate File 3554, which is this bill that was introduced and took me by surprise. I've been in real estate for 30 years now, as I'm 48. I bought my first rental property when I was 18. I do a lot of maintenance and repairs and renovation on properties. And of course, there's restrictions on people like me, for working on rental properties. I have gutted and completely wired and run all new plumbing in houses that I live in, but I can't do certain things on rental properties. There's a bill that came through that is going to be restricting the sale of paint to everybody over like a gallon. So like if you want to poly your floors and you want to go buy the 2.5 gallon jug of polyurethane, you can't do that anymore because you're going to need a license to do that and be a licensed contractor. And they're creating this new paint contractor board of bureaucrats at the state to sit there and try to grow their responsibility and inch their way into everybody's lives in this growing nanny state. Have you guys heard about this bill on the House side?
Yeah, it's definitely the joke bill of the season. It's been the source of no shortage of mockery, which unfortunately does not mean that they won't pass it. I mean, they very, I don't know if likely is the right word, but they very well may pass something stupid like this. It's right up their alley. They love to tell you what you can't do. They love to tell you how to do what you can do,
Yeah.
and this accomplishes both of those things.
Now, I spent several years on the housing committee in the Minnesota House and heard a lot of bills similar to this that try to grow the state's intervention in people doing work on their house. There's another bill traveling in the House that would prevent you from being able to replace your electrical outlet or your light switch. Or
Right.
like simple wiring. It's not talking about complete wiring, but it's nice to go through and replace outlets that are damaged or loose, to put in new ones because they're all of like 15 cents to buy a duplex. And this bill would prevent people from doing wiring in a rental property where you're just replacing your own outlet. You're not doing major. This is easy weekend warrior stuff to be able to
Yeah.
go do things like this, and it's just going to lead to more degraded housing out there. I had a rental property in the Arts District in Northeast Minneapolis, and it had been all new wiring, all new furnaces, and everything. It was a really well maintained property. But in the basement, it was an unfinished basement where there was laundry down there. There was some old knob and tube wiring that was running the joists, which are two like tar wrapped, cloth wrapped wires. But it wasn't. They were cut on both ends, so it was just wiring that was there. And when the housing inspector was coming through, he motioned, "Oh, you got some knob and tube wiring." And I went to go grab it to pull it out because you could see it was like 10 feet long. And he said, "No, no, no, I got to write you up for that. You have to have a licensed electrician remove that." I'm like, "You can see both ends of it. It wasn't pulled out of the joist." Nope. So like that removal of that knob and tube wiring cost me over $600 because I had to hire someone to go pull a permit in Minneapolis to come and remove that, two little strands of wire that were
Yeah.
in the house.
Yeah. So I don't think our thinking on this, on the conservative side, conservative slash libertarian side, has ever been terribly refined. Usually, you get. I mean, you get like these one-off complaints about bills like this, but then you also kind of get this sort of untenable, all regulation is statist position that sometimes gets thrown out there. Regulation can absolutely be appropriate, but it has to have a governing principle. And to my mind, that governing principle is the action that you are seeking to restrict predictably going to cause harm to another person, predictably going to cause a tort. So something like noise nuisance ordinances. Um, we predictably can say that in the event that one neighbor cranks up their stereo to the point where it prevents the guy next door from being able to peaceably enjoy his property, that is on some level a tort. It is on some level a harm. And so it's appropriate to have in ordinance a restriction upon that behavior, saying, look, this isn't appropriate. We're not going to allow this, so that you don't have to waste everybody's time and money with these little small claims lawsuits about such, trivial stuff. Um, that principle obviously doesn't apply here, right? Like, who were you harming by trying to fix that problem in a property that you own? Like, who are you harming when you try to switch out an outlet or a light switch, or who are you harming when you go and buy 20 gallons of paint and decide that you're going to paint all of the rooms in your rental property? You're not harming anybody. Nobody is being harmed by that. And if there is some conceivable harm that could take place, like you don't know what you're doing and you wire it wrong and you burn the house down, or you use the wrong paint or too much of it, or you don't vent it or whatever, um, those are things that are not li- likely enough. They're not, they don't have a certainty to the level that it justifies regulation. Like the noise nuisance example is one where we know the harm is going to be imposed if we allow this behavior to take place. But some of these more nickel and dime Mickey Mouse things, you have to conjure the specific one-off circumstances where it might hurt somebody. Well, if that were to occur, that's what lawsuits are for, right? Like, you don't need to have a regulation in place to prevent every possible harm that might conceivably happen to someone. That's not what the code, our statutory code, our ordinances and what have you, are meant to affect. It's not, we don't need to be protected from everything, as you put it, a nanny state, from the folks who we entrust with public responsibility.
Right. And, I look at, see, I'm 48. So when I was in college 30 years ago, I look at the housing that was out there at the time, and these like boarding houses at the University of Minnesota. And everybody shared a bathroom, and very few of us had air conditioning. It was like maybe once in a while somebody'd have a window air conditioner, and you'd gather, and they were like, we suffered through some pretty tough housing, but it's a period of time you go through that kind of sets you on a path like, hey, I don't want to live like this when I get older. I want to work hard to have a decent house. Now, when you go to campuses and everybody has central air, has their own space, has underground parking, garages, all this kind of stuff, it's a completely different housing world out there. And it makes things so unaffordable. So housing is so expensive nowadays. And on the housing committee, they talk about, well, we want to have affordable housing. We want to have these subsidies to help pay for housing, because housing shouldn't cost, X percentage of your income. Well, the more regulations you put on builders and property owners, the more expensive it becomes. There's a balance. You can't have both. So I just was shocked at this paint one, especially because I still refinish hardwood floors and paint with oil-based paint. And the fact that I would not be able to buy more than a gallon because I'm not a licensed contractor is just completely ridiculous. Let's jump into some gun bills that are coming through. Republicans, every year we talk about the Democrats, whether we're in the majority or the minority, we talk about the gun bills they introduce, because it's a bill to discuss, to get people off the couch and get them engaged in the fight. Of course, last year, the Democrats passed red flag laws, and they're coming forward with laws that are going to completely ban the transfer of semi-automatic guns. And I mean, it's serious. This is very serious gun grabbing, gun restrictions. And of course, you and I know these bills don't work because they only work for people that follow the law, and they do nothing to prevent criminals from actually getting their hands on these guns. So do you have some of the bills offhand? You want to talk about the semi-automatic gun that is it Finke that he introduced, or Pinto?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Before getting into the specifics of the bills, I think it's worthwhile. And I'm glad that I've had a few days to process this so that I can temper my comments and restrain myself a little bit because I was very, very angry about this over the course of the past week. I think when we look at what happened in Burnsville this weekend, where you had a man who was, again, I'll restrain myself and not speak speculatively about things that haven't been confirmed, but we can certainly say was called on, was the subject of a 911 call because of alleged domestic abuse at 2 o'clock in the morning with 7 of his kids in the house. Um, the cops show up. He shoots 2 of them, kills them, shoots a medical first responder, kills him, injures a 4th guy. Turns out this piece of filth had a warrant for his arrest based upon previous sexual assault, domestic assault. All right. So you've got Tim Walz and Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar and every Democrat legislator, including the 3 or 4 legislators from that area who are Democrats, standing up on the House floor, shedding tears, talking about how sorry they are and how we need to rally behind our first responders and how important their job is and all this nonsense. And I say it's nonsense because it's coming from them, the same people who are enacting and moving forward these laws that you're talking about, and who simultaneously support a policy of prosecutors like Mary Moriarty, who was another one who piped up talking about how tragic it is what happened in Burnsville. She pursues a policy that says that if we catch a street criminal who is guilty of one of these gun crimes, we're going to turn around and put him right back on the street. Or we're going to do everything we can to ensure that he faces the least amount of time behind bars as possible, and that he probably get himself enrolled in some sort of community services provided by a community group that's going to include education, housing. You know, we're going to come alongside this guy who's guilty of a gun crime and make sure that he's got everything he needs to get his life back in order. This guy who shot and killed 3 first responders in Burnsville is one of those guys. He's one of their people. He's one of their projects, somebody that they want to work on and rehabilitate and make into a better person. Now, you and I both know, and everybody listening knows, that if the circumstances were slightly different, let's say this guy was driving down the highway. Let's say he was driving down 94 in the middle of Minneapolis, and he had a taillight out. And he was pulled over by, say, a state trooper. And things escalated, and he started pulling off and dragging the troopers behind him. And in order to try to defend themselves, they fired and ended up killing him. But the officer survived. We know for a fact, because that literally happened with Ricky Cobb, that Mary Moriarty would be prosecuting the officers involved. So these heroes who are now dead under different circumstances where they survived and he died at their hands while they were trying to effect an arrest that he was resisting, they would most likely be finding themselves, if not under prosecution and facing charges, certainly under assault, rhetorically and politically, from everyone in the Democratic Party for once again killing another black man. Another black man dies at the hands of police. Now, they can't deploy that narrative in this situation only because this particular black man died at his own hands after killing 2 police and a medical first responder. But that's the if you're wondering at all, and I don't know that anybody is. I mean, I feel as though this is an issue where you're either on the right side of it or you're contemptible. I don't see any possibility for middle ground on an issue like this. But if there is that person out there, that person who's on the fence, who just doesn't know what they think about this, just realize that the same people who are calling for new laws that will criminalize you storing your firearm in your house in such a way that you can actually access it when you're under threat, and will criminalize the sale and transfer of the weapons you need in order to defend yourself, and effectively, through attrition over time, ban guns. That's what this is. And to your point, Jeremy, that's going to have a direct impact and a lasting impact upon law-abiding citizens. And at the exact same time, the people who violate those laws and get caught on the street,
Yep.
aren't gonna face any prosecution whatsoever.
Well, I shouldn't have to remind the listeners, why gun legislation moving in the legislature is so extremely dangerous when it happens right after a tragedy like this. Representative Pat Garofalo, who's a Republican, was quoted this morning here by saying, 3 heroes got murdered last week because a lunatic had a gun. As far as I'm concerned, anything is on the table to stop that from happening. We need to do a better job at the Capitol working together so we can have one less or none of these things happening. So it's emotional legislating where you want to do anything you can to prevent something like this from happening. And this is where we hear a lot of terms with it. If it saves one life, this isn't discounting what happened. This is knowing the reality that criminals don't follow laws, and that anything that you pass at the legislature is not going to prevent this from happening, because this is a person who was already prohibited from owning a gun. Had he been following the laws that we already have, he wouldn't have a gun.
This is a guy who shouldn't have freedom. This is my overriding point, is when your focus is on the object rather than the person, on the object rather than the behavior, then of course these situations are going to manifest. The problem is not the fact that the guns he had exist or that they were available to be purchased. The problem is that he was free to purchase them. Now, illegally, right? Like, it was illegal for him to have those guns. He does not have legal gun rights, or he did not have legal gun rights. So he violated the law to obtain those weapons. He violated the law by possessing those weapons, and he violated the law when he used those weapons to kill 3 first responders. So what? One more Jenga brick would have held the tower together? That's what you're telling me? We've got plenty of laws. Laws aren't the problem. The problem is that when you have pieces of human trash like this guy, who don't abide by our laws and who break the public trust, who break the social contract, we do not hold them to account. We prioritize making sure that they don't become an embarrassing equity statistic over protecting our wives and our daughters from their violence. That's where we're at as a society. And it's time that we look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, how feckless can we be as a state to have allowed that to become the status quo, where we are actually saying out loud that it's more important for fewer Black people to be in prison than it is for our wives and daughters to not be raped, for our cars not to be carjacked, for our neighborhoods not to descend into war zones. Like, it's somehow more important to feel good about yourself at a liberal cocktail party than it is to keep people safe. The level of ivory tower elitism required to arrive at that perspective is unfathomable to me, but I'm surrounded by it here at the state office building.
Well, the bill that would prevent a transfer of most semi-automatic weapons, including, I think, semi-automatic shotguns, that bill may not pass because there are some Democrats that actually support guns, especially, up on the range, and it would be pretty toxic for them to pass. But there's there's legislation around making sure that you have your guns locked up in a gun safe and being law. But tied to that bill is the ability for police officers to come into your house to inspect your guns to make sure that you have your guns locked up. That's where it crosses the line into violation of one's privacy, and there's just no possible way to enforce that law because we don't have a gun registry, and there's nothing that shows how many guns you have in order for them to confirm how many are locked up. Like the enforcement mechanism of so many of the gun bills that the Democrats are proposing aren't even enforceable. It isn't going to solve the problem that we have with criminals having guns, and it's not going to prevent the criminals from getting guns. Although there's another bill that would require you to immediately report if you have a gun missing, in order to not be liable for what happens with that gun if someone steals it or obtains it some way and uses it for something bad. Of course, there's been bills in the past that have that proposed by Republicans to have when you transfer a gun to someone else that you do a background check. You pay $50 to have a background check for that person, and then by selling them the gun privately, you're not on the hook for anything that they do with the gun. But there's already you're already shielded from liability unless you know that person's a criminal in the first place. So this is Republicans offering, legislation like that. And the Democrats, I'm sure, have that bill as well this year. But, again, it's enforcement. How do you know when that gun was transferred? You don't.
Yeah, well, and yeah, for me, the bottom line is that these people are obsessed with objects. They're obsessed with guns and firearms as if they're some sort of talisman of evil that causes people to do bad things. And they're completely unconcerned about the people themselves and the actual behaviors and addressing the behaviors and responding appropriately and getting dangerous people off the street and affecting a safe environment for those of us. Because that's the thing, it doesn't matter how many guns are out there if you live in a society where the rule of law and law and order and peace is kept. We had that society for a couple hundred years. We had that society where everybody had multiple guns. They literally carried them on their hip, and it wasn't a big deal. It didn't cause huge problems because of the character of the people who we allowed to roam the street. The few bad apples who couldn't abide by the social contract either got taken to the gallows or they got thrown in a cage. And that's how we kept affected public safety. And it worked. Addressing the behavior works. Addressing the person works. Pretending that the problem is the gun does not.
Right. I want to throw some bill numbers on this, the couple bills that I just mentioned, and I just looked it up this year. Andrew Myers, who's a Republican, introduced the bill to grant immunity to private parties who require proof of firearms eligibility prior to transferring a firearm. So again, this is before you transfer, not selling it, but just transfer it to your neighbor or your friend. If you pay to have a $50 background check done, you can transfer to them and then you're not responsible. The problem is if you pass this bill, then the court will assume if you didn't do a background check, then you are liable. It lowers that burden for someone who doesn't do that background check, which, for people that loan a gun to someone, it's like the slippery slope. But here, you have a Republican offering this bill where it sounds common sense at the get go. You say, look, I have a lot of assets I want to protect, so I want to make sure there's no liability in selling you a gun. Well, if that's the case, then sell it to a gun dealer and not to a private person. If that's your priority, but you shouldn't be infringing on everybody else's right to sell a gun or transfer a gun, give it to their nephew or whatever. And, this is bad legislation being brought by Republicans as well. And then what do we have here? The really bad bill from Finke, I think it's House File 3570, which is to ban the sale or transfer of semi-automatic They call it, of course, military style assault weapons, which really doesn't have a definition, but we can we can get into that in a different episode when we see these bills moving forward as they get through committee.
Yeah, well, I just love the complete contradiction that is unfolding here, where on the one hand, there's this effort to hold innocent people accountable for other people's crimes. So somebody stole my gun and committed a crime, and it's somehow my fault. Somebody, you know, you had this case recently of a mom who was convicted of manslaughter because her son shot up a school. Now, might she be guilty of some crime? Maybe. Is it manslaughter? Like she was part of her kid doing that? Probably not. But it's becoming increasingly popular, especially when there's a gun involved. Increasingly popular to try to transfer liability for that crime from the person who actually did it to some person up the supply chain who played some role in the process of that gun eventually getting to that person. And yet, simultaneous to that, we have a movement in our prosecutorial and criminal justice system where there's zero accountability for prosecutors and judges letting known violent criminals back out onto the street to commit crimes again. Where's the liability there? I want to see prosecutors go to prison because somebody they refused to pursue charges on went on to rape somebody else. I want to see judges go to prison because they decided to do a downward departure on somebody who got out of prison or was on probation and committed another crime that resulted in somebody's death or great bodily harm or sexual assault or something along those lines. I want to see these people pay a criminal price for making decisions that directly result in harm to others, as opposed to somebody being the victim of a crime. Your gun is stolen. That means you're the victim. You're innocent, but your assailant, the person who stole from you, commits a secondary crime with the property they stole from you, and then it's somehow your fault. You're somehow responsible. You're somehow criminally or civilly liable.
Well, well,
Absolutely perverse.
when you're talking about holding judges responsible or superintendents of schools that make bad decisions on school resource officers, what it sounds like is you're supporting removing qualified immunity for public officials, because that bill is introduced, I think, in the Senate, and it isn't about police officers. It's about removing qualified immunity for all public employees, teachers, judges, and everything else. So when they make bad decisions that have repercussions that harm people, they can be held civilly liable for that.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I know I don't like the idea, and I've stated in the past why I don't like this idea of trying to remove qualified immunity because of the context in which the proposal is being made. Like there's an ideological laboratory experiment somewhere where it does make sense, but in the real world that we live in, where we have this concerted effort that's manifest in this SRO issue to throttle the profession of policing to the point where it no longer exists or is so thoroughly neutered that it's not capable of doing anything other than inspecting people's homes to see if they have guns so that they can go to prison for having guns lawfully. Um, I don't think that's the context in which we want to provide police officers with one more reason to either quit or never become an officer in the first place.
Yeah, but trying to figure out how to hold judges accountable, because we've been unsuccessful to hold judges accountable in the ballot box for making bad decisions. It is next to impossible to try to recruit attorneys to run for judge, because if they lose, which name recognition or a power of incumbency on the stupid ballot is so powerful, attorneys don't want to end their career because they have to stand in front of that judge they just ran against, so they don't like to run. But doing something to hold judges and county commissioners accountable to making all these really bad decisions, to releasing criminals so easy, giving them a slap on the wrist.
Well, it's funny you should bring that up because Governor Walz just retweeted and lifted up this effort being put forward by the Democratic Governors Association, whatever it is that they call themselves, where they're highlighting their push to appoint lefty judges to state benches wherever they can, which they've been doing anyway. I don't know why this is somehow being highlighted as some new initiative. It's just a political stunt, right?
Yep.
But here's Governor Walz, who is the chief executive of a state where the Constitution calls for judicial elections, and that has not been changed. That is still our Constitution, a document that he has sworn an oath to uphold. And here he is out publicly advocating for judicial appointments from himself in violation of that Constitution, and not even thinking twice about it. And it's one of those things where my instinct is that nobody cares. Like, even on our side, nobody really cares that that's the status quo, that the governor's appointing judges in a context where we're supposed to have meaningful judicial elections. But we really, really should care, because all of this muckraking that we do about, prosecutors like Mary Moriarty and the abuse of the law and the laws, the bills that are being introduced by Democrats, none of it makes any difference if at the end of the day you don't have judges who are willing to uphold the law and value their public trust above their leftist ideology. And this is something that the left has figured out. They figured out a long time ago. Right? It started in earnest in 2001 after the Bush Gore thing, that their path to power is not elections. Their path to power is the administrative state, the bureaucratic state, and judicial decisions. And it doesn't matter what your laws are. I believe this quote is attributed to George Soros, of all people. Doesn't matter what the laws are, it matters how they're enforced. And they have all of their people in place to enforce the law in the way that they see fit. And the only way you're going to change that is by having meaningful, political, rip roaring, knockdown, drag out political elections for judges. And so we need to see some significant reform to make that the case in Minnesota. You should have to fight tooth and nail to keep your seat as a judge every term in the state of Minnesota. It should be a knockdown, drag out fight. And we should put protections in place to ensure that there is no retaliation against lawyers for challenging a judge, and that if such retaliation is evidenced, that there's some aggressive sanction that can be placed on that judge for doing so.
And in the Republican Party, we continue to have discussions about whether we should be getting involved in judicial elections or not. Ideally, justice is blind. It shouldn't be partisan. But as we've been fighting amongst ourselves on this, the Democrats have continued to appoint highly partisan judges, and we suffer as a result. So I'm going to do two plugs here. First of all, if you're listening and you support the principles that Walter and I talk about a lot, you need to be at the LEA banquet on March 7th in the Twin Cities in Mounds View. Go out to lea-mn.org. Speaker Steve Deese is going to be presenting. He is awesome. He's got a great podcast. He's from Iowa. Again, March 7th, lea-mn.org. Check it out for their awards banquet. We're going to honor 10 legislators that voted the right way on the bills that we scored. And then also on Tuesday, February 27th, is caucus night. If you want to get out and make a difference, choosing your legislators, getting involved and hopefully getting involved in judicial elections as well. Get involved in the party politics. Go to caucusfinder.sos.state.mn.us or just Google Minnesota SOS Caucus and get to the Secretary of State's website. Find out where your local precinct caucuses are being held for the Republican Party and get involved. Go out and talk with your neighbors about the issues that matter most. Bring forward resolutions to change the party platform and what we believe in, and become a delegate to your county precinct. And you can help with legislation with your legislators. You can press them on issues and hold them to their endorsement if they want to be a Republican.
Yeah, so I'll take those in turn. First of all, I don't know that I've ever been more excited for any political event or politically adjacent event than I am to hear Steve Deace and to potentially meet Steve Deace. here in March. This is a guy who is just the tip of the spear in terms of fighting for the causes that we believe in, and has no fear, just none. And it served him well. I mean, he has managed to, and he's talked about it often, the, the times that he's thought it was all over because he went too far and standing on principle, and it just ended up paying off for him and keeps paying off for him. And, maybe one of these days he'll be in jail, and so will I, and so will you. But so far, he's meeting with tremendous success and just being a great thought leader in our movement. And then on caucuses, I'll just add this. The primary responsibility that you're taking on, because it's not just when you get involved in the party, it's not just a, hey, come let your voice be heard and decide who your endorsed candidate's going to be. That's a huge part of it, and we want you to do that. But you are also joining us when you do that. Like, you're becoming part of this operation whose mission statement is to get our endorsed candidates elected. And that has to be the laser focus of what it is that we do. Once we come together, once we decide who we're going to support, by God, let's do it. Let's support them. And I will say, without violating confidences and, saying things that I shouldn't say, that there have been a lot of conversations that have been happening around here that indicate that you're being heard in the grassroots when it comes to these concerns regarding the party having a heavy hand, or organizations like the caucus putting the thumb on the scale of how things turn out. There's always going to be an inherent interest in the caucus to maintain its majority and to pursue a majority. And to protect its members. Like, that's not going to change, and I don't think it properly should change. But I do think we need to respect the fact that the party has its process, and that our collective job, no matter what organization we find ourselves associated with, is to support those people who you endorse. So if you stay laser focused on that goal, we might have a chance in 2024.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Walter, for joining for another hour of the Omnibus Podcast. And to listeners, thank you for tuning in. And don't forget, if you're streaming it on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also download the podcast at Apple Podcasts and a dozen or so other podcast sites. So thank you, Walter, and thanks, everybody, for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.